Hi students, the previous lecture we covered value types and reference types. This lecture I'd like to cover the latter half of chapter 4, which talks about converting from one type to another. So there's a myriad of ways that you can do this. There's really not one way that's better than the other. Depending on how you choose to design your application. If you want to throw errors up to the user that says, hey, whatever you typed in isn't going to work with my application. So if you're trying to type in a subtotal and they type in garbage, maybe you want to throw up an error to the user. So maybe you want to catch some sort of exception that does that, or maybe you just want your program to fail gracefully and they can figure it out later. Really, there's no right or wrong answer depending on how you want to do it. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the different ways that you might choose to do it. The book talks about a few different ways, and we've even talked about a few of them already throughout my videos. One of them is the convert static class. Remember, we've talked about that already. So if you look here at the top that I have commented out, you can convert to a decimal, whatever it is you're trying to convert. So in this case, it's the text subtotal. But we'll find out that there are problems with this convert subclass. It does what you want. If you want it to convert it, that's fine. But what it doesn't handle is if they type in garbage. So you notice if they type in garbage, there's an exception here that's unhandled. If you don't handle it, what can happen is your program will just crash. The user won't know what happened, and they'll have to open it up again and figure out what they did wrong. It just isn't a great user experience for that to happen. Now, not to say that it can't be fixed or you can't. We'll figure out ways later in the course that we can try to catch the exception. We can try to do some defensive coding where we can take in what they have here, and if it isn't a decimal, we can return back an error to the user that says, hey, what you typed in, like I said, isn't going to work with our program, so please fix it before you hit the submit button again, or whatever the case may be. Whatever the UI does, I'm sure you've seen Amazon. Or Amazon or any other web program, it might turn the text box red instead of just throwing up an error page or whatever. So it really depends on what you want to do for your application. So the convert subclass isn't terrible as long as you handle that exception that might occur. As long as you, we call it sanitize the input or clean the input. That way we can make sure that what the user gives us is going to work with our program. So the convert subclass is one of the things we can do. We can convert to a decimal. There's also many other things we can do. So if we do the dot after the convert, we can convert to integers, we can convert to S bytes, UINTs, date times, characters, boolean. So there's no shortage of things that we can convert to with this convert subclass. So that's one of the options you can choose if you're trying to convert maybe text that you have coming into something else. Maybe you're trying to convert something to a double, or an integer to a double, or a double to an integer, whatever you're trying to do. We've also had instances down here where we've had to convert something. Let me Control Z back this. Where we've wanted to convert something maybe to a string, and then all of the value types have a .toString built into them. So we can do a .toString, and you can pass maybe a C if you want to convert it to a currency. If you want to convert it to a percentage. And these all can be found in your book on page 123. So none of the, if you work with these enough, you'll start memorizing what each one of them are. F is a float, N is a number, P is a percent, C is currency. None of them are really worth memorizing as they're an easy Google search away. So I wouldn't try to go memorizing them. There's where they're at in the book if you ever need to try to convert anything to a string and you want to format it in a certain way, but I wouldn't really recommend memorizing anything that minuscule. But the last thing I wanted to talk about when you try to convert is the parse and try parse methods. And again, you really had to cover reference types and value types before we got to this. That's why I haven't covered it yet until now. So one thing you can do when you're trying to convert is you can use this try parse method. Oh, I need this comment out. Okay. So what the try parse method does is it's kind of a cheat way to return two things at the same time. So for example, we have a decimal. In the decimal, we call this a wrapper class because this is a class that handles anything you can do with the decimal value type. So that's why this is a capital D decimal and this is a lowercase d decimal. So there's these wrapper classes for all of the different value types. There's one for int32, there's one for int. So anything you want to do with these different value types, you can use the wrapper class for. So in this case, we're going to use the decimal and we're going to use the .try parse method. So this is going to say, try to parse out whatever is in this text box text. So you can see, if I want to do, don't worry about this var. I'll talk about this var here in a second. Int 32 dot parse, and notice when you try to go type something out, you can hit tab and then hit we're calling a method, so you can hit an open parenthesis, and then from there it tells you exactly what this thing requires. It requires a string. So let's go and type out this try parse method, see what it does. So let's do this int32.try parse, put in the first parenthesis, open parenthesis, and then you can see it takes a string. So that's the first thing that I gave it up here. I gave it this string that I'm trying to parse. And I want to parse this text property that's on my text box of subtotal. So let's do the same thing, text subtotal.text. And now when I type in a comma for the next parameter, it should highlight or make bold the next parameter that it takes. So now look at bolded this. So now we have something called an out keyword. Well, what an out keyword does, and they also have another keyword that's similar called ref. And what that does is, don't worry too much about if you don't understand this completely, just make sure you get the syntax down, that way you can use it if you need it. But what that does is it forces this value type to be a reference type. So what does that mean? Let's look here. I don't necessarily have a subtotal what's the word I'm looking for? I don't have the subtotal field anywhere on my screen, or this subtotal variable. I guess variable is the word I was looking for. But because I tell it that it's an out, or I use the out keyword, it forces this to be a reference. So now it's a reference to all of these other subtotals here. Or it's a reference that comes back from this method. So this method returns a true or false if you hover over it. Notice that it says a return value indicates whether the conversion succeeded or failed. So return a true or false, and then from that true or false, you can choose whether or not you want to do the rest of your math with it. So let's see what happens if I then type in garbage with this. So let's type in garbage and hit calculate. So notice it didn't throw an exception this time. It just defaulted to 0. So let's see exactly what it does. Let me set a breakpoint and see exactly what it sets this to. So let's type in garbage again and hit calculate. And notice when I go to result, it says false. So it must have tried to parse my DD from my text to a decimal, and it said that string is not a decimal. So what it did is it made this subtotal, 0. So instead of making it null and trying to do math on a null or just an empty property, it made this a 0. So now it's trying to do math on a 0 wherever it goes. So this try parse fails a little bit more gracefully than the convert does, but it still might not give you the desired outcome. So maybe you don't want it to be 0, maybe you want to throw an error. So maybe you can have a text box if subtotal equals 0. Then you could throw a message box dot show your input is not valid. Otherwise, it should continue to go on with the logic. So let's hit calculate. It says your input's not valid. Okay. But it's still really not what we want because it's still going to go through the rest of the logic. But in any case, the user still knows something went wrong. So that's just an alternative to the convert class. You can also use the parse and try parse for all of the different wrapper classes. I showed that there was wrapper classes for decimals, integers, doubles, or floats. So any value type you can think of, there's a parse and a try parse for it. There's a wrapper class for it. We covered the different string conversions you can do, so you can convert any value type to a string. You can format it any way you'd like. And I believe that's all I wanted to cover for this video. The next video we're going to start covering control structures. We're going to start covering for loops, while loops, do while loops, and then the main one you'll use, which is the for each loop. So I hope you like this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.